I'm standing at the separation fence in the south of Israel, 20 kilometers north of the town of Beersheba. It's not a place where we usually think about the separation fence and the wall, but the Israeli government decided to build the fence around the whole of the West Bank as a means of separating Israel from the Palestinian territories. The construction of the separation fence was a unilateral policy of the Israeli government when Ariel Sharon was Prime Minister. They believed that this was a way to bring about an end to the suicide bombers and to enhance the security of Israeli citizens. But clearly it's a lot more than that. You just have to look at the fence behind me to know that this is an international border in the making. Much of the separation fence has actually been built along the course of the Green Line, but there are some areas which have deviated and have de facto annexed parts of the West Bank, mostly in areas where there are Israeli settlements. Now, both the International Court of Justice and the Israeli Supreme Court have ruled that some of those deviations are illegal and should be changed. I think that on the whole, Israeli Jewish public opinion does support the wall because they saw it as a sort of a short-term solution to the problem of suicide bombings. I think also most Israelis, there is a consensus around the idea that if there is ever going to be resolution to this ongoing conflict, it has to be territorial separation and the establishment of two states. The socio-economic conditions of the Palestinians on the ground in both the West Bank and Gaza, but particularly in Gaza, are probably worse than they've ever been since 1967. It's partly due to the Israeli retaliation to the latest intifada, and clearly when you have such terrible socio-economic conditions, the possibility of having political stability is very, very low. And I think many Israelis understand that if there is going to be some sort of conflict resolution, then the socio-economic conditions have to improve for the Palestinians. The public discourse in Israel relating to conflict and peace has changed over the past 10 years. You still have groups of very radical right-wing settlers who would prefer to continue the occupation. They believe this is their historical homeland and they want to continue building settlements. They're not prepared to evacuate their settlements. You've still got some people on the far left who believe that we've missed the two-state solution and there needs to be a single binational, secular, democratic state of all Jews and all Arabs. But I think the vast majority of Israelis have moved towards a centrist consensus. People who used to be on the right, people who used to be on the left, have moved towards a consensus which appreciates that there has to be two states for any form of solution to come about. Israeli public opinion, on the whole, totally supported the Lebanon war, regardless of the devastation that was caused in Lebanon. There was criticism amongst some Israelis of the extent of the retaliation, but the fact that the Hezbollah continued to rain rockets into Israel, and for the first time in 50 or 60 years, caused damage in towns and settlements to the civilian infrastructure. All past wars and conflicts had taken place on the border or even over the border in Lebanon, in Egypt, in other people's territory. And this was the first time that suddenly the Israeli perception that there was no existential threat to the civilian infrastructure, that life went on as normal even during wars, this was completely shaken to the ground. The initial invasion was justified by the kidnapping of the two soldiers by the Hezbollah. But clearly there was clear intelligence that Hezbollah had been building up their whole infrastructure of rockets and weapons in South Lebanon since Israel's withdrawal. And as far as Israel was concerned, this was in complete contravention of the agreement that was made when Israel withdrew. And once Israel invaded, and literally the minute after Israel invaded and the rockets started coming in, this sort of gave a retroactive justification for many Israelis to sort of continue to justify what was happening. It's very clear that the Israeli response to the rockets was disproportionate, but then many Israelis argue the coverage of the war in the international media, they also argue was disproportionate, and that what was not shown was the fact that there were daily rocket attacks in the middle of Haifa, in the middle of civilian settlements, that a third of Israeli civilian population had to evacuate the whole of the north of Israel for about 6 weeks. It seems to many of us that Israel was waiting for the opportunity to sort of try and take the Hezbollah out. And of course, the kidnapping of the two soldiers was the excuse for doing so. But I think the Israeli public and the military and the politics were totally unprepared for the extent of the rockets that came in during the war itself. There's been a tremendous amount of criticism of the Israeli army and political leadership at its inability to really achieve the objectives it thought it would achieve in Lebanon and in a much shorter time period. Of course, the government will argue that they did take Hezbollah out and that they have now created a situation with a UN force preventing new rocket attacks coming into Israel. But overall there's been tremendous criticism, and as you're well aware, it's resulted in the resignation of the commander of the Israeli army, and it's resulted in huge criticism of both the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister and their perceived inability to deal with this particular problem. One important factor explaining Israelis' perceptions of the conflict today has been the introduction of the discourse of demography in the past 5 or 10 years, where Israelis have come to realize that if the occupation continues and the Palestinian growth is faster than that of Israelis, then 20, 30 years down the road there won't even be a Jewish majority in this region anymore, and there won't be the raison d'etre for the existence of a Jewish state anymore. There are still the vestiges of post-Holocaust feeling, that only we can defend ourselves and only we can stand up for ourselves. Even with conflict resolution, many Israelis believe that the world is hostile to them, particularly the Arab world and the Middle East. So there is this feeling, and it comes out in all public surveys made of Israeli public opinion, that the one thing around which there is consensus amongst the Jewish population, and when I say consensus I mean over 80 and 90%, is that they want to retain the Jewish majority in the Jewish state, even though that this sort of nation-state idea is something which is a bit passé in world politics today. There are still the vestiges of post-Holocaust thinking, and often you feel that when people don't really have a good answer as to why there should be a nation-based state in today's world, they fall back on the Holocaust argument because they're unable to argue a rational argument any longer. But Israel has never really come to terms with this basic dilemma between its self-definition as both a Jewish state and as a democracy. Because clearly once you define the state in national terms and you give one group more rights than another, it can never be a total democracy. And this is a dilemma which has faced Israel since the day it's been created.